Hi. In person. I remember seeing you.
Yes, good to meet you.
Well, yeah. Hi. Heather? Yes. Yeah, good. And you were on the phone call too. Very good. Well, you'll be here for 2 days.
Yeah, we got Thursday and Thursday.
You're here till Thursday?
Yeah, we have a grand today. We got a session tomorrow and meeting stuff. Kind of sitting on a few of the projects. Go and take some photos, get a feel for the place, try some of the local restaurants, spend some money.
I think Wednesday, you can meet Peter Hansel, businessman, and
Okay.
sort of retired.
Hello, Peter. I'm David. Nice to meet you.
They say he's retired is a bit of a stretch, but
Try.
anyway.
Good evening. The hour of 6:30 p.m. having arrived, I will call to order this regular meeting of the Joint Planning Board and Planning Licenses and Development Committee. Anyone wishing to view a copy of the agenda and supporting materials will find it on the city website. If you are in our audience tonight, you may access the agenda from any mobile device. Copies of the printed agenda are available in the wall pockets just as you entered the room. To receive electronic copies of future agenda packets, please go to the homepage and subscribe to the city meetings email list. The public and other board members will be recognized to ask questions and make comments on the agenda items under discussion. After being recognized, all remarks are to be made through the chair. Anyone who wishes to address the committee is asked to go to one of the microphones in the room and identify themselves by name and address prior to speaking. Will staff please conduct the roll call?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the Planning, Licenses, and Development Committee, Kate Bosley,
Here.
Phil Jones,
Present.
Raleigh Ormerod,
I'm still here.
Robert Williams,
Here.
Edward Haas.
Here.
For the Planning Board, Harold Farrington,
Here?
Roberta Master Giovanni,
Here.
Mayor Jay Kahn,
Present.
Councilor Mike Remy,
Here.
Sarah Vizani,
Here.
Ryan Clancy,
Here.
Kenneth Cost,
Here.
Armando Rangel,
Here.
Gail Summers, Randon Markelon,
Here.
Tammy Adams, and Michael Hofer.
Here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right. Moving on to the next agenda item, which would be an approval of our previous meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the January 8, 2024 meeting?
I'll second.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question on the minutes.
Mayor Khan, you mentioned development in Concord, Massachusetts. Was that Massachusetts or was that New Hampshire?
Massachusetts.
Okay. Question withdrawn.
Okay. Good. All right, so we have a motion and a second to approve the minutes. Are there any questions, comments, or changes to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to a vote. All in favor of the minutes? Any opposed? Minutes of the previous meeting are approved. Okay. We have 2 public workshops tonight. So moving right into those. The first of these is a public workshop for ordinance O-2023-16A relating to permitted uses in the downtown core, downtown growth, and commerce districts. Petitioner, City of Keene Community Development Department, proposes to amend Section 8.3.2 of Article 8 of the Land Development Code to add a definition for charitable gaming facility and amend Table 8-1, Table 4-1, and Table 5.1.5 to display charitable gaming facility as a permitted use in the downtown growth district and commerce district. In addition, the petitioner proposes to amend Section 8.4.2.c.2.a of Article 8 of the Land Development Code to remove drive-through uses as a permitted use by special exception in the downtown core district. Okay. At this time, I would ask the petitioner to present on the proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jesse Rounds, Community Development Director. I'm putting up on the screen, and I will try to make sure that you can all read it. The definition that we prepared for charitable gaming facilities when we came before you last, the A version. And I guess I'll start by saying we believe that there's more work to be done. That was the direction from council. That was the direction from P.L.D. So we want to dig back into this, and we want your advice, and that's why we're here. One thing I will say is that we do not foresee any reason to change the drive-through question, but we're open to discussion on that item too. But really what we're looking for is, this is the A version. This was our attempt to address the concerns we heard before, but I think as we discussed this, there was just what should happen, actually. There was more and more discussion, there were more and more concerns raised, and now we're getting another chance to dig into this. So I appreciate everyone getting into this issue as much as planners do. So thank you for pretending to be planners. We appreciate the citizen planner in all of you. And with that, I don't really have a direction to take this except to say we would love to hear concerns, ideas. We'll take notes. It's recorded. I think maybe a little bit of history on this. We came with the unbolded version of this. So the part of this definition that's unbolded is what we came to you originally with. And you said, could we tune this up to try and get at bingo and lucky 7? And so we said, yes, of course we can do that. And I continued down the path of very complicated definition. And we didn't really look at the zones that we had proposed. And that's the other part of this that I want to talk about. And that is, we said at the time we proposed that it occur only in downtown growth and commerce. And there were a couple reasons for that, really having to do with that's where we have a casino now in downtown growth, and we had a casino in commerce in the past. So that's what really guided us on that subject. And Evan's got a couple copies of the zoning map shrunk down. I will put the zoning map up on the screen, and then there are zoning maps sort of spread around if you want to get up and take a look, we can also, like I said, I will put it up on the screen, and I can zoom around, and I will try and do it slowly so people don't get seasick. With that, happy to take questions, comments, concerns.
Councilor Bosley?
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to kind of get us a little bit jump-started because this is coming back from council, and the planning board is probably recalling us having a long discussion about it here. We held a public hearing where we heard from several members of the public, and we also got a really special opportunity to talk to the Lottery Commission. And I think that was a big part of the conversation that we had. Council got involved in, obviously, the public's input and then a little bit of perspective on how these casinos work, and I think that was really helpful for us. There's lots of licenses in here, and some of them are codependent on another. Some of them have moratoriums placed by the state currently. We're waiting to see what's going to happen with those moratoriums going forward. Those different licenses create different opportunities for these uses to be profitable or not. And it all sort of starts to tie back in with what's the potential size of one of these facilities. And I'm going to steal someone's comment. These things never get smaller, they just get bigger. And it has come to our attention that, we've been very focused on new potential licensees, but what we became very aware of is that we already have a licensee who's operating in our community, and I don't think there was a whole lot of attention paid to what a 20,000 square foot casino in Keene, New Hampshire would look like, and where would we want that? And so, there was back and forth conversation about would new licenses even be issued, and where would we want to have small boutique casinos? But the reality is that these licenses are tied to municipalities, and if another license is never issued by the state, there's already one here, and it's already in Keene, and it can't leave. If it's going to exist, it has to exist here. And they've expressed interest in growing. So I think part of the conversation council really wanted to have is, what do we think is the best use zoning for a larger square footprint? And then the other piece is the use standards. Like, what are some of the things that we want to see tied to this type of use? And what's some of the direction we want to give planning board when they're reviewing these projects, and what type of things would we like to see put in as protections for the community? So that's the conversation I'm hoping for P.L.D. and you guys to all be involved with tonight, to give staff some direction to come up with a new draft for us.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Mr. Clancy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious to hear the reasoning behind looking at, I don't know, I think there's 5 or 6 downtown districts, maybe 7, 6.
There are
5. So why was the, I'm losing my train of thought.
Downtown growth.
Growth. Why was growth allowed in seeking exemption, even though it kind of bleeds into, at least the east side downtown growth district bleeds into neighborhoods? Why was that one incorporated into a possible exemption into this?
So the idea partly was downtown growth is, again, where the existing casino is located. And I felt like it was bad policy to make it a non-conforming use from day one. So that was part of it. The other part is that what downtown growth is for, and that is growing uses, larger uses. And this is going to be, I think, as Councilor Bosley said, this is going to be a growth use. And so that's, downtown growth is intended for that. A lot of the other downtown districts, downtown core is pretty much going to stay the same size forever. Downtown growth is where we're gonna see that growth of businesses and change. Downtown transition is intended to transition over time into either office or residential uses. And now your downtown edge is actually intended to grow and change into either the next downtown neighborhood or more residential uses. And I'll be honest, now I'm out of downtown neighborhoods in my head. But I think that it was the appropriate place to see this type of use grow. Not to keep saying grow about growth, but that was the idea.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. So I guess I have a question and then a comment. The question is, the downtown growth area, the downtown growth area, that is, if that became a question, you know, is that more like transition? Is that more like, it's a really very undefined area right now. So to call it, it's just undefined. That's what I'd call it. And eligible for lots of different things, including housing and lots of. But an existing use there would be grandfathered.
Absolutely correct. And it could continue. Our code even allows it to grow at a certain rate. I think it's just, from my perspective, it was, like I said, bad to start in a situation where it was immediately a non-conforming use if we changed it and took downtown growth out. That's not to say that's a bad policy or a bad decision. It was just, that was my thought.
Yeah, understood, and my thought might be different from yours.
Absolutely.
Given the undefined nature of that entire footprint that's called growth.
Right.
If I could continue.
Yeah, please do.
I think, I appreciate Counselor Bosley wanting to kickstart the conversation, try and get us to, can we find some agreement in the proposal that's in front of us? And I'd like to suggest that I think there, from my perspective, a point on which to start some agreement is the commercial zone. It has characteristics of larger storefronts, lots of parking, perhaps a compatible use that has daytime shopping and late afternoon, evening, nighttime entertainment or gaming would fit into a nighttime use when you've got so much parking that's probably in lesser use than it is during the day. So I guess I'd like to put that forward as at least a point of agreement with the proposal, leaving the other parts that where it might be potential as, you know, do we need to really go there at this point? I mean, we change our zoning many times over, and particularly around a proposal, and it won't affect an existing licensee. So I guess I'm comfortable with at least getting that far in the proposal in whatever the Plan B program is suggested.
Counselor Ormerod?
Thank you. I'm amenable to that suggestion because the downtown growth could incorporate so many different things. It could be housing. It could be community arts. It could be all kinds of things that are more consistent than what we've always thought about what our downtown and our downtown growth area should be. And so a large charitable gaming facility that expands to fill its space may not, for many, be within their vision. So we want to leave some space for the other things that we think and you decide are within the master plan.
Mr. Cost?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm agreeing with both conversations, and at the last time we discussed this, I read the definition of downtown growth. I won't read it all again, but the last paragraph, it's worth reading again, because the last sentence in the paragraph says, new construction and infill that complement the walkable urban form of Keens downtown. I mean, the intent of it is to be the next downtown. And so I think when you read the rest of it, it feeds right into that, mixed use and commercial and residential and civic and cultural. So I think the vision for the downtown growth is quite different. And the commercial area, even physically today, is, well, there's a lot of empty storefronts, first of all. There's lots of parking lots that could be built on if it made sense. So there's, tons of room to develop and build. There's probably, I'm thinking of West Street, but there's probably other areas that are commercial. And so it does make sense also that if we're going to do something like this. And also, I think you mentioned, one of you mentioned the conflict of during the day, the commerce districts are busy, people are shopping, they're in stores. At night, the parking lots are empty. And although people probably do gaming things all through the day, I would, nighttime might be more of a peak time. I'm not sure, but it seems like it might be. So then that would be also a complementary use of it. But I think the downtown growth has huge potential for much higher use things for our city, is my feeling. Thank you.
Mr. Clancy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the comments that have just been made, and I was using this opportunity to ask questions, so, and wait, is public going to be asked tonight?
Yes.
To comment?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to reserve what's been brought up tonight for that moment, so just want to bring the conversation back to questions right now, and then.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Haas?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just point out there's significant overlap of the historic district into the downtown growth district, which will further complicate things as we try to get something going there.
Good point, thank you. Councilor Williams?
Thank you. I'm in agreement with much of what has been said. I guess my concern about having it in the downtown growth areas is mainly it's a conflict for residential uses. I don't think anybody really wants to live near a casino, and I also don't think it's good for neighborhoods to be necessarily within walking distance of a casino. That's a good way to create poverty. So I'd be particularly concerned about having one of these on the east side, for example. I think along 101 might be all right, maybe over by Target or one of those big box stores. I could see one of them being repurposed. But I would not like to see it in the downtown growth district.
Thank you. Councilor Bosley?
Thank you. So I'm also on board with this. I think this is a comment that I made at P.L.D. When we were preparing to send this back. I was not comfortable with the downtown growth use, and I feel better about that decision listening to Mr. Clancy, because I think having the maps in front of us really helps to show that that's area abuts very residential neighborhoods. And I think that the intention that we have for that space is not to create a use that requires a vast amounts of parking lots and cars sitting. You would have to build some sort of structure with parking under it, I believe, to fit in with the style of the growth that we want to see in that area. However, I just want to propose for consideration as we're going around and discussing, and I don't know if staff has any input into this, why it would be or would not be a great suggestion, but I know that there is some possibilities out, and in my mind, I see this surviving and doing best off the highway, right? So you have the light purple space on Optical Ave that I think relates to Industrial Park. Is there any reason why, I don't know how it's gonna look on the screen. My map shows it.
It's light purple here too.
Okay, so is there any restrictions in that zone that would prohibit us from allowing this use there? And how would we feel about including something like this in an area like that?
I can address the restrictions. So industrial park is one of our more limited zones. However, that's the point of this process is we can add uses. We do try to add uses that make sense with the other uses, and I would say industrial park would be difficult, just based on what else is there. And I would run over and get my book if you want me to look at what other uses are there, but that's absolutely not a requirement. That's just a guidance. And Evan may be looking at it right now and could pipe in if.
For industrial park? Okay, so we allow office as a commercial use as well as research and development, daycare as institutional, industrial uses, light industrial and data center, and then open space for conservation, and then infrastructure such as small, medium, and large-scale solar, and then telecom. And it's got a 4-acre minimum zoning, but relatively favorable build-out and impervious surface at 25% building coverage and 70% impervious. So the intent or the purpose of the industrial park reads as follows. The industrial park district is intended to provide for relatively low-intensity manufacturing and research and development firms that are employee intensive, clean in nature, and promote an attractive industrial park environment. Service operations and sales activities are excluded from this district except for minor sales that may be accessory to the primary use.
Thank you. Mr. Clancy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of turning into a sidebar because of the conversation, but I mean, while we're looking at the master plan and zoning as a whole, I think it's important to look at, does an industrial zone need to even be in? I guess the question for this conversation would be commerce versus industrial, and is there a benefit to actually having industrial zones?
Mr. Cost?
Thank you. First, I mean, one question would be, do we need even more land for where charitable casinos can go than we would have in commerce? There's a lot of commerce land that's underused. It's just not developed. Where I think in industrial, if we are fortunate and Keene starts to attract some serious manufacturing, more manufacturing and more high-tech or whatever it is, we don't have a lot of big land areas with good access. That's the only site I see on that map. And so it might limit an owner or a company owner to come here if there was a casino on the site, or there could be a casino on the site, because, you know, I would think there's a lot of synergy and activity with trucks coming in and places to move and not have a totally unrelated use. And so anything that would limit the attractiveness of the land that we have for that, I don't think would be the best thing to do.
Thank you. I actually have a question for you as well. Well, at the risk of moving us backwards, do you have a feel for what comparable cities in New Hampshire are doing in terms of positioning these types of uses?
So I did look at that soon after the conversation started to move away from the limited conversation we had before, and they're kind of all over the place. Some communities really want them focused in the downtown. Some of them are pushing them to the edge, that sort of highway-based development. I also think, and this is something that's come up a couple times in conversation, so I don't think I'm letting the cat out of the bag. One of the things that we've talked about is use standards. So that's a way you can say, you can even more limit the areas that it's permitted, and that a lot of communities are using that. And they're not unreasonable to say, you know, again, the size of your casinos, they're gonna be big, so you say you have to have X number of square feet of space. And so that's gonna limit the number of places that's possible in Keene. And one of the things that worried me when we first started having this conversation, and I'm not sure I'm even allowed to have this opinion, but there are commerce zones peppered throughout the whole city. And I think there would be some people who would be nervous about a casino appearing in one of those other commerce zones. You can use use standards to really limit where it's allowed. I'm gonna editorialize again, and my concern with the parking lot discussion is, yes, this is one of those perfect planning situations where you get to say, oh, it'll activate those parking lots in the evening and at night. The concern I would have, though, is that if you co-locate someplace like Target with a casino on weekends, you have a perfect storm of everyone being there all at once. Not to say that some of our parking lots that are very large couldn't handle that, but that's a use conflict that I think we ought to think about as we go forward. Sorry for taking it off in a different direction.
Mr. Clancy?
Before I can talk about more of my opinion about this matter, I would urge that we hear if anyone from the public has anything to say to this matter, because I'm intrigued, because there's a lot of hearsay in the community about timelines for what's
Yes,
been
we'll
requested and
have,
stuff
it's a
like
public
that.
workshop.
Yeah.
We will get,
Well, yeah.
public will
No,
get an
yeah.
opportunity.
It would help my opinion if.
Okay.
I-
Counselor Jones?
Thank you very much. Something Jesse said put something in my head. You were talking about the different commercial areas, and I think you're talking about the nodes, the village-type commercial areas that we have. And I think you're exactly right. We don't want that type of activity in those places. And when we started doing our rezoning, this was even before you were here, I said, couldn't we call that a different zone? Those three, I think it's three nodes that should have their own zoning, because there's certain uses besides what we're talking about that don't fit in with those nodes and could ruin a node. And that might be another way to go. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, yes.
Just want to understand and yeah, thanks. I want to make sure Counselor Jones's point is well understood, that we've got some commerce areas that are just small nodes in neighborhoods, right? And the suggestion is that at some point to separate commercial into maybe commercial 1 and commercial 2, with one of those being defined as small pocket kind of commercial area with limited uses. Yeah, good. That's useful.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Ms. Master Giovanni?
I agree with pretty much everything in terms of, trying to concentrate these gaming facilities away from neighborhoods and more into commercial areas that don't infringe on other commercial activities that go along. But I also would say that if we had a 20,000 square foot gaming facility in our city, that would certainly bring a lot of business all throughout, throughout downtown, throughout Target, throughout everywhere. So it's could be a real benefit, and I think wherever we place it, we just want to make sure that all those people there, because they will venture into our city. So how they get there, how we transport them there, in and out, so they have good access to the hotels, to the restaurants, and everywhere else. So that's my thought.
Thank you. Councilor Bosley.
So just to follow up on that a little bit, I think one of the things that came forward in a lot of our discussion, which on the onset of this, like, we're not experts in casino business development and design, but the premise of how casinos get their money is to keep people there. And so I think that it became obvious, there was lots of conversation about, well, people would go to this boutique casino and then wander around and do their shopping. And in general, casino operators don't want you to leave. So when they're building out a casino, if people are leaving to go eat, they put a restaurant on site. If people are leaving to go shop, they put a shopping area on site. And the best use for them to get people to continue spending money there is to keep them on site. So when we looked at like how long cars would be in a parking spot, for instance, somebody goes out to dinner downtown and it's a 2-hour, in, out of the restaurant. But a casino is probably more than double that of a person using that space and not the car not moving. So I think that there are these little nuances that just are very specific to casinos, that it took us this whole process of educating to kind of get to a place where we really understood what some of the unintended consequences would be. And I think I'll just wrap up my comments by saying, when we get to where we think, and it sounds like we're pretty getting close to an agreement that we like the Commerce Zone, I would be open to staff bringing us back a draft with with appropriate use standards to keep these out of those pocket commerce nodes, or to accompanying it with a potential new ordinance that redefines those nodes into their own district. I think that's appropriate. And regardless if we do that, I would also like to see what staff would think would be appropriate use standards for this type of use, now that we've had all of this information brought to us.
Thank you. Any further comments? Seeing none, I will, at this time, invite the public and remind people, this is not a formal public hearing, it's a workshop. But if there are members of the public that wish to offer comments or questions on the proposed ordinance or this discussion we're having about it. So just show of hands if anybody in the audience would like to speak. One, okay. Yeah, why don't you come up? There's room at the table there.
Peter Hansel, 61 Bradford Road. I have to admit, I didn't come tonight actually to talk about this. I didn't realize it was on the agenda. I was here for the next item on the agenda, but I did make my opinion known at the previous public hearing before the City Council, and I am curious as to the discussion going on tonight, and I have to say I'm very pleased with the way it's going. I like the idea of looking at downtown, all the downtown zones, as something special, and probably not a place where we want to put a gaming facility. So I just encourage you to keep going in that direction. That's my only comment. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I didn't see other hands, but anyone else? It's your opportunity. Okay. Seeing none, I will close the public workshop. And we'll move on to deliberation. So our options are, this is not news to you, but we can continue the workshop. We can make a motion to defend the draft ordinance, or vote on the ordinance without any amendments. Any thoughts? Councilor Remy.
Based on those options, I would move to continue the workshop to allow staff to come back with another draft that more aligns with what we've discussed this evening around limiting to commerce,
And I think it's Commerce Limited is the one we're trying to avoid, or is that something else?
I can,
Something else.
Commerce Limited doesn't seem to exist anywhere in the city.
there's a small area of Commerce Limited south on Winchester, but the nodes are just commerce out in the neighborhoods. And got that loud and clear and some use standards we can bat around, and would love to bring ideas back. So
I'd second the motion.
Thank you, Councilor Jones. Okay, we have a motion to continue the workshop, and it's been seconded. Any discussion or comments? Councilor Haas?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you just said it, Jesse, at your last statement, to emphasize that use standards must be applied to any new occupancy that we consider in the city.
Thank you. Mr. Clancy?
I just wanted to speak briefly because it seems like our discussion will come to an end pretty shortly. I just want to highlight on Councilor Bosley's comment about parking. I think when we look at, and my comments are geared towards the city and their considerations for what they propose to us. I think when we look at parking and people's timeframes on how long they stay at a parking spot downtown isn't the best argument in determining proposals or what businesses we allow. That is the heart of this community, and people should be allowed to enjoy being in our community, and we can't dictate how they use their time in our community. And as far as this, I think we're going to start looking at a larger zoning regulation, because this idea of the nodes is intriguing, and I hope the city takes consideration, because I don't think any downtown district would be appropriate in terms of what we're proposing. It just doesn't seem to correlate to allow it in the growth district, with it being so close to the other districts in that area. It would just not, the point of downtown growth, or downtown, is for it to be one beating heart. And, if we allow it in one downtown district, that's essentially saying it's allowed downtown. So I'd like to see something that doesn't relate to downtown, if that's the direction we're going into. If we're going to restrict it in downtown, let's restrict it in downtown.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Okay, so we do have a motion which has been seconded to continue the workshop to our next meeting. So we can, do we need a roll call vote? Is that, I'm not sure who's on the Zoom, but.
I don't believe we need a roll call vote. I think you can just do a
Okay. Voice vote?
hands up. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so, so the motion on the table is to continue the workshop to our next meeting. All those in favor of the motion? Any opposed? Motion is continued to the next, or I'm sorry, the proposal is continued to the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for the direction, and we'll come back with a lot more information, I hope. So that's the plan.
Thank you. Okay. We also have a second public workshop item, agenda item, and it is as follows. Ordinance -0-2024-01, relating to amendments to the City of Keene Land Development Code zoning regulations, Cottage Court Overlay District Conditional Use Permit. Petitioner, City of Keene Community Development Department, proposes to amend sections of Chapter 100, the Land Development Code of the City Code of Ordinance, to add a new Article 17, Cottage Court Overlay District Conditional Use Permit. Amend Article 3 to allow dwelling, two-family, neighborhood grocery store, office, restaurant, retail establishment, light, daycare center, and community garden as allowed uses with a cottage court overlay conditional use permit in all residential districts in Article 3. And that tables 3.1.5, 3.2.5, 3.3.5, 3.4.5, 3.5.5, 3.6.5, 3.7.5, and 8-1 be updated to reflect this change. Amend Article 3 to allow dwelling, two-family, and dwelling above ground floor as allowed uses with a cottage court overlay conditional use permit in the rural, residential preservation, low-density 1, and low-density districts, and that tables 3.1.5, 3.2.5, 3.3.5, 3.4.5, and 8-1 be updated to reflect this change. Amend Article 3 to allow dwelling multifamily as an allowed use with a cottage court overlay conditional use permit in the low-density 1 and low-density districts, and that tables 3.3.5, 3.4.5, and 8-1 be updated to reflect this change. Also, amend Articles 17 through 28 of the Land Development Code and all subsections and references thereto to reflect the addition of a new Article 17. End of proposed ordinance. Okay. I would like to invite applicant, the staff, to present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have our consultant on the line with us right now. He had intended to be here in person. However, due to some airline difficulties, he wasn't able to make it, so we've got him virtually this evening. This is Bill Eubanks. Community Development Planning staff have been working with him to craft this ordinance that's before you this evening. So I am going to hand it off to him and let him work his way through the proposal, and then staff will also be here to answer any questions as needed.
So can y'all hear me?
No.
You're pretty quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Very faint.
So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let me know when y'all can see the screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, I'm going to go through this presentation pretty quickly. You've all had a chance to review the ordinance. If there's anything that we need to go back to, we can go back. And I do apologize. It was my intent to be with y'all tonight. American Airlines had different ideas. So to start with, the purpose of this is to address some...
Bill, can you hold just for a moment, please? We're just checking if there's a technological solution on our end that we can make it a little easier to hear you.
Okay, great.
So if you would just bear with us for 1 minute.
He's coming through the TV speakers here, so bear with me a second.
Yeah. Singing is not my forte.
Is it time to try everything?
No, it's been tried, believe me. Including a karaoke bar in Singapore. But even then.
Is Asa not here today?
Bill, can you say something for me?
Yeah, can y'all hear me now? Is that better?
No, hold on.
It's not your end, it's ours.
Yeah.
They should be able to turn it up.
What is the middle speaker? Oh, yeah, I remember that. Hiding behind the projector. Where is the speaker?
Bill, you want to give it another shot?
Bill, can you try again?
Yeah, can y'all hear me now?
That is better.
Okay, is it good enough? Or do we need to tweak it more?
Use your outside voice.
Yeah, I think we're good enough to.
I'll speak up. So the purpose of this was to address some specific housing needs in your community, with an emphasis on the missing middle, senior, which is 55 and up, and workforce. And we're doing that through an overlay ordinance that would utilize a conditional use permitting process. So the term missing middle is something that we felt like we needed to address a little bit. And when we speak of missing middle housing, we're really talking about housing forms that were more predominant really prior to World War II. Things started changing after that war. But duplexes, row houses, courtyard apartments, what I call mansion apartments, which are apartment buildings that have the look and feel and character of a single family house. And these are some images that are actually from Keene that address that kind of missing middle feel and look. We also wanted to address workforce housing. So we have here what the definitions are for workforce, both for rental and for sale product for Keene. So we're doing this because you guys had the forethought to do a housing assessment study that showed that even though your population is shrinking, the number of households is actually increasing because the number of people living in a household is actually declining. 40% of your population lives alone, which is a staggering figure to me. You've also got a lot of displaced workforce, people that are having to travel into Keene to work there instead of live there. You also have a lot of households that are cost burdened. That means that more than 30% of their income is going to housing related cost. That's a third of the households in your city, and that jumps to 39% for seniors. And for rentals, it's even higher for seniors. It's a 43% cost burdened. Your housing needs assessment also showed that you're going to need an additional 1,400 new housing units over the next 10 years. So this is one of the tools in the toolbox to get you there. So going into the meat of the ordinance, we have the purpose of it, which is to promote infill and redevelopment, encourage efficient use of land, to expand the range of housing choices that are available with your changing demographics, and provide for flexibility in such a way that it also helps strengthen existing neighborhoods. So that's encouraging development in areas that are already kind of pedestrian scaled and safe and affordable. So applicability, this would generally any land located within the overlay would be subject to this article. Moving into the, so districts defined. This would be available to be done in R, RP, LD, LD1, MD, HD, and HD1. And it would be done by a conditional use permit. So here you see the land use chart. You see the different types of dwellings that would be allowed under those different underlying zoning districts. So we tend to get a little bit more dense with the housing types that are allowed as we go to more dense underlying zoning districts. So you can see, things like townhomes, multifamily are only allowed in the more dense districts. We also allow for some non-residential uses. We allow commercial uses as long as they are on a corner, as long as they have a maximum of 1,000 square feet and they have a residential use above them. We also allow daycare because that can help strengthen a neighborhood. Again, it must be on the ground floor, a maximum of 2,000 square feet, and must have a residential use above it. We also talk about kind of ancillary uses to the residential uses that are allowed. So things like laundry buildings, storage buildings, common use buildings such as kitchens, meeting areas, exercise areas, things of that nature, and also things like picnic pavilions and other things for the use and enjoyment of the residents. Attached or detached garages are also allowed. and they may have a unit above them. That is allowed. So projects may be developed on a single parcel of land, either with either a property management entity if it's rental, or a homeowners association or condominium association if the product's for sale. It may be also developed as a subdivision with units on individual lots, in which case there would also need to be some type of property management entity or homeowners association or condominium association. We also allow that stormwater, when you're looking at stormwater, you'd be looking at it for the entire development, not individual lots, because the way things are clustered, the lots may actually be very, very small with shared common open space. So we wanted to look at that holistically and not as the individual lot. Also, just, if there are condominium or HOA involved in this, they have to meet all the applicable state statutes. We have the dimensional standards. There is no minimum tract size. The minimum tract frontage is 30 feet. We talk about perimeter setbacks of buildings, that they can actually match what's existing on either side of them instead of meeting the setback requirements of the underlying zone. There's no minimum lot area, minimum road frontage on internal roads of only 26 feet, minimum lot width at the building line, front, rear, and side setbacks, no requirements. No minimum or maximum density requirements as well. In the lower density residential districts, we are asking for a maximum height of 2.5 stories or 35 feet. The underlying zoning allows 2 stories and a 35-foot height. So we're just saying that extra half story, there may be, kind of the finished attic space with dormers, things like that, but not actually increasing the height. In HD and HD1, it's a maximum of 3 stories or 50 feet. And we also get into, parking under a structure. If it's not in a flood zone, that bottom floor counts as a story. If you're in a flood zone, first floor is measured from the FFE or base flood elevation plus 1 foot. So there have been some questions about the perimeter setback. So we did this little graphic to show the underlying zoning would more than likely have a 15-foot required setback. Most of your residential zones do. But if there were existing buildings on that street that had setbacks of less than 15 feet, the proposed development would be allowed to match that existing setback instead of having to go back to the 15-foot. That just kind of helps the street seem more complete, and the buildings are relating to each other and to the street. So there's no minimum unit size required, although there is a maximum average square footage of 1,250 square feet of floor area, excluding garages. The maximum footprint is 900 square feet per unit, excluding porches and garages, unless it's age restricted, and we've increased that to 1,000 square feet for age restricted. That's because they usually want a master bedroom on the ground floor for age restricted. The way we've done the parking is really quite simple. There's a minimum of 1 space per unit, or 0.75 if it's designated as workforce housing or age restricted, and a maximum of 1 space per bedroom. Those parking spaces, maybe surface spaces in garages or carports, they can also be located off-site. They can be 500 feet from the furthest unit unless the housing is designated for age restricted. Building separation is simply determined by applicable fire and building codes. We don't have any internal separations. Driveways that are providing access to 3 or more units have to be a minimum width of 20, a maximum of 24. And we get into, clear access for fire access, things like that. We also say that where feasible, driveways should incorporate design features that give them the appearance of a street, so that even if it's a driveway, it feels like a street with sidewalks, street trees, and lighting. Internal roads would have to meet your existing standards, although we do have a statement in here that variation from those standards, if deemed appropriate, may be achieved through a waiver process as described in Article 23. We're certainly not promising anybody they can get a waiver, but we wanted to put that in there so they could at least consider that possibility. We talk about screening from adjacent uses with a semi-opaque or opaque fence, and also that the planning board can approve a landscape buffer that provides similar or greater screening. Architectural guidelines. I wanted to spend some time on this. I know the planning board will be responsible for also reviewing these projects for their architectural merit. So what we've done is we've developed kind of a list, instead of having like really specific design guidelines, we've developed a list of things that would be easier to approve, things that would be more difficult to approve. So for example, if you are putting the narrow frontage of the building to the street, that's going to be easier to approve than putting the wide frontage to the street. If your parking is screened from the frontage, that's going to be easier to approve than parking visible from the frontage. So what I'm going to do is just go through some examples of this, just so you can kind of see that. And these are always going to be judgment calls. That's why we don't say allowed, not allowed. We say easier to approve, more difficult to approve. So narrow to the frontage versus wide to the frontage. So the two images on the left are buildings that present their narrow frontage to the street. The ones on the right are presenting their wide frontage to the street. Parking screen from frontage versus parking visible from the frontage. So the images on the right, the top right is a parking lot. This is a multifamily project, obviously, with a parking lot between the building and the street. And then the lower right is a building that's, it's a snout front garage where, pretty much all you're seeing of the building is that garage frontage. Where the images on the left, the parking is tucked in on the side and not really visible. Building-based differentiated versus a building being monolithic. And this is one where you're really going to have to use some discretion here. And I put these images in on purpose because these are difficult. So the ones on the left show a differentiated base. The ones on the right do not, but they're actually pretty good buildings. So you have to look at kind of the building in totality. You have to look at the height, the mass, the scale, the fenestration, things like that. And in this case, I would say, okay, you didn't differentiate the base, but they're still good buildings. We're going to let it slide. So taller ceiling heights versus shorter ceiling heights. We would prefer taller ceiling heights. Our firm does a lot of multifamily design. And our standard is to do 9-foot ceilings, not 8-foot ceilings in our multifamily units. And one of the main reasons we do that, besides the fact that it feels more gracious when you're in the building, is that it allows us also to do 3x6 windows as a standard instead of 3x5 windows as a standard. So more natural light, more ventilation. But again, it's a subtle difference, with the images on the right being buildings that have slightly lower heights, and the buildings on the left, some that have slightly higher ceiling heights. Natural and integrated integral materials versus composite and cladding. So buildings on the left, brick and wood, they're natural and integral materials to the building. The ones that you see on the right are composites and cladding. So synthetic stone, things like that we would typically frown on. Structural expression versus surface expression, and this is another one that's a little bit hard to to gauge. But when you look at the images on the left, you do see some structural expression with the way they have open eaves, and you see the rafters and things like that, where it's really just kind of surface expression of the stone on the image on the right. Thicker wall depth versus thinner wall depth. This is another one that you'd have to actually get into, probably looking at the wall sections to actually determine if this is being done right or not. But if you look at the images on the left, and with those windows, you see a little bit of shadow, and so you see that there's some depth there, where the images on the right, you're not seeing those shadows. You're not seeing that depth. The windows are right there on the surface. And we prefer the depth and seeing that shadow. And then simple, clear massing versus complex massing. So whether it's a traditional structure or a more modern structure, if you look at it and the masses are easily readable, clear, concise, not fussy, that's going to be easier to approve. So like the images on the right are much more complex and kind of a mixed message in their massing, where the ones on the left are not. Vertical fenestration versus horizontal fenestration. And this is one of those things that it plays into the ceiling height. It also plays into the orientation of the building to the street. Those things all kind of work together, but we prefer vertical fenestration on a building as opposed to horizontal, kind of the old picture window look of the 50s and 60s. Repetitive fenestration versus mixed fenestration. And this again has to do with kind of the overall massing of the building and how it reads kind of as a thing on the street. And we find that when you use repetitive fenestration, it typically tends to read a little bit clearer than something that has kind of mixed or mismatched fenestration. Contextual materials versus unrelated materials. So you guys kind of know what kind of the contextual materials in Keene are. So you also know when something pops up that feels foreign to you. So, things like, clapboard siding, along the coast, or stucco, like the bottom left photo, which is actually my town of Charleston. And then you look at the images on the right, where those materials they don't fit in. They don't fit the context of where they are. And then lastly, landscape unifies versus landscape is unorganized. And here I used all good examples. But that is something that, the landscape, especially when you're talking about homes that may be on very small lots, or homes that are part of a common regime and share common open space, that landscape can go a long way to make it feel unified and that it belongs to everyone. So this is just kind of the nuts and bolts of the conditional use permit application procedure. It's not unlike doing a conditional use permit for anything else in your city. There's site plan review, there's subdivision review. We go into what those submittal requirements are, very specific about that. And that's it. I'd open it up now for questions and discussion.
Bill, if I could just jump in here really quickly. One of the things that staff kind of made a decision on in regards to the submittal requirements is specific to site plan review. We set a threshold of a cottage court development that includes 5 or more dwelling units is going to have to go through full major site plan review. Every one of these projects is going to have to come to the planning board. But if it's a smaller development, we're not necessarily looking for like the traffic study, the full stormwater analysis, like a comprehensive lighting plan. Like we don't want to kill smaller projects by front loading all this unnecessary like engineering site plan review. So one of the things, when we discuss all of this, one of the things we are going to ask you is if you feel like that threshold is appropriate. Should it be more units that are essentially exempt from full site plan review, or should it be fewer? And then we'll also have to make sure if that matches up with our existing regulations for current, more traditional multifamily style projects. So just something to consider with everything else.
Thank you, Mr. Clements. Okay, at this time, thank you, Bill, I appreciate that. We'd like to open it for questions and comments from the board. I'm going to start with a question for you, Bill. I know you had public workshops in town. Could you just comment on the overall reaction from Keene residents? And secondly, can you highlight any changes that you made to your original plans based on that? Any feedback?
So first of all, I felt like we had good turnout at both of the public meetings. Even more so at the second meeting. We had probably double as many at the second meeting. Generally, everybody was incredibly favorable of this idea. We heard more of like, when is this going to happen? Everybody seemed very enthusiastic, so that was great. I can't think of any specific tweaks that we made to the ordinance based on that. I mean, Evan, Jesse, can y'all remember any specific tweaks that we made?
We were pretty emboldened by the ideas that we presented being very warmly received during those workshops. I know we also worked with other stakeholders, like some realtors within the city, which helped us craft that average square footage of 1250 as opposed to putting a hard cap on it. But in regards to general public opinion, like Bill just said, like when can we start? Like these are all great. Let's do more. So it seemed to be very well received.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Councilor Williams.
Thanks. I like, just about everything here. Thank you for the great work. One thing that did stick out to me was the daycare center requirement to have housing on top of a daycare center. I'm not sure if those two uses are necessarily compatible. There might be security restrictions that people might not want somebody living on top of their daycare center. Additionally, you might have a situation where somebody wants to turn their house into a daycare center, which I wouldn't necessarily say no to. I'd want to leave that option open. I think maybe we don't need to require housing above the daycare center. I do like housing above the storefront, but the daycare center I would put an exception to.
So if I can respond to that, one of the things when we talked about this is that the purpose of this overlay is to provide housing. So I kind of look at it as if we do allow daycares, that's kind of just gravy. But we didn't want to allow daycares at the expense of not providing more housing, because this overlay is for additional housing. That's one reason that we decided to go ahead and do the residential use above the daycare as a requirement. Daycares, by definition, are being used during the day when most residential users are going to be at work. So we really didn't feel like there was a conflict between the two. And I think they would, the way they're designed, I think, they'd probably have completely separate entrances, one from the other. We also limited it to 2,000 square feet, which I thought was key, that way it stays at a small kind of neighborhood scale. But, just want you to remember, this is an overlay to provide housing.
If
Yeah,
I could,
Mr. Williams, if
if
you-
I could just
Councilor
comment,
Williams,
I appreciate it's an overlay to provide housing, just to say that our daycare crisis is just about as bad as our housing crisis. So I think, if we could make some room for that, it would be helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Clancy?
I guess this question would be more for city staff instead of Mr. Eubanks. I've heard some, is there any condo restrictions in the city of Keene? Like, new condo developments? I feel like I've heard that in the past.
We don't, our regulations just view it as an ownership model, not as like a development style, so we don't differentiate. If the applicant wants to do it as condos, that's up to them, or if they want to do it as rentals, that's up to them too. We don't really look at it differently except for legal documents and responsibilities of that association.
Councilor Remy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I keep getting stuck trying to differentiate between this and a manufactured housing park in like form, and whether it's just, maybe a manufactured housing park is a cottage court, but a cottage court isn't necessarily a manufactured housing park. But I'm trying to figure that out, and I'm really getting stuck on differentiating that and why we don't just expand the zones where manufactured housing parks are allowed, and what the differentiation is really.
So manufactured housing is actually defined in state statute as being a housing structure that is permanently affixed to a chassis, where the dwelling can be hitched up and moved. So currently within the city of Keene, you could use, to use a different word, let's call it a modular home. So fundamentally it's the same thing, however, there's no chassis and it's permanently affixed to a foundation. That is currently allowed by right in the city of Keene. If you've got a lot and you want to put a modular dwelling unit on it, get a building permit. So that's the major difference between manufactured housing versus a cottage court.
Councilor Omrod?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing I've noticed about many neighborhoods of Keene, especially the low density, and others that are dealing with, that this ordinance is dealing with, is some of the lot sizes are pretty small, and you can't really build out, but you can build up. Yet we're limiting it to 2.5 stories, where 3-story Victorians are very much in common with the character of the area. So I'm wondering why and under what circumstances could you put a Victorian, 3-story Victorian, or is that only a high-density 2 type of application?
If I can respond to that, I do not disagree with you. And we had a lot of discussion about that with staff, and the reason that we settled at the 2.5-story 35-foot instead of going full 3-story is that we were worried about possible pushback from existing neighborhoods, and we felt like that this would be a little bit more palatable than saying 3-story, although you do have precedent for that in your city now. So I'll just say, if you guys decided to vote to change that, I wouldn't be opposed. But we didn't want to run the threat of getting pushback from existing neighborhoods.
One follow-up?
Yeah, please.
I understand at some point, if you stack too high, you are no longer low density, you become a high density. So I can understand that. And, we're not building towers, but I was specifically looking at the Victorian style and would actually make it more attractive to invest in neighborhoods if you would allow some of those. All right. That's all I had to say.
Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Continuing with that height section in 17.5.2B, I wanted to make a comment about number 2, or in the high density, that a maximum height of 50 feet would be limited to 3 stories with parking underneath, potentially being one of those stories. And just to do the massing, a parking structure doesn't need to be more than 7 feet. So say it's 10 feet, 10 feet, 10 feet. With a pitched roof, I've done dormitories of this dimension, and limiting it to 50 feet, okay, maybe. I think we allow an HD1 to exceed that height level, first off. Second, at 50 feet with parking underneath, I think you can get 4 stories. So I guess I'm questioning these limitations on height in the same way that Councilor Ormerod did that for the lower density areas.
Evan, can you clarify what the existing height is in HD and HD1? I was thinking it was 3 stories or 50 feet.
So high density has it at 2 stories above grade and a max building height of 35 feet. And then high density 1 has max stories above grade 3 with a max building height of 50 feet.
Okay. So the heights fit. Yeah.
So we're
I
actually,
just, with parking underneath it, it just didn't make sense to me to limit it to 3 stories. All right. I'm putting the question out there for people to test it, to make sure that we're not putting a restriction there that a developer who could put parking beneath the structure, which is a pretty common approach, I think, for something that's 3 stories.
So, Mr. Mayor, just to clarify, you're thinking maybe not counting underground parking as a story, but still keeping that total height limit?
It's not specific to underground. It's that parking beneath 3 stories equals 4, and according to these guidelines, and that, to me, that could fit within a 50-foot height restriction.
Okay.
Ms. Finazzi, Pizzani, sorry.
It's okay, it's a pretty tough one, but thank you. So I wanted to circle back to, and then I will comment also if I can on the height, but I wanted to circle back to what Councilor Remy said about the manufactured mobile. So with the manufactured homes, typically in the parks, you don't own the land. And I just want a question of clarification. With these multifamilies, you will own the land, or will they be some sort of association where you don't, and you're just owning the property itself, more like a cooperative situation? Can I get an answer on that first?
We are not limiting ownership models. So the whole project could be owned by an entity that rents out the units like an apartment building, but they're all little detached, or maybe they're townhomes, and it's a condo association where you've got common land around and you just own the building, or you just own the townhome unit. One of the overarching goals of this proposal is to reduce limitations. So it's whatever kind of housing product is appealing. Somebody can come in and kind of use this overlay guidelines to mold a product that fits into an existing neighborhood.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful, and I love that there are reducing those limitations, because so you will be able to have one person that could own all the units, or you could have one company or one project developer that owns all of the units. Okay, so I love that about that project, so it's a little bit more flexible. And then when we come to around to the height of it, so it's interesting because you could have a grade situation where you're parking below a little bit, so half of it could be below. where you're actually parking, and then there could be some living in the back of it. So you could have half of it be a garage situation and still have a story in the, or part of it in the back, and that would still fit within that mold. So reducing those limitations does allow for just a wider flexibility, being able to create housing in these situations, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I saw Counselor Bosley was next.
So I have a short list, if you'll bear with me. Okay, so one of the things, and I've addressed this with staff, and I want to hear from the consultant and staff of how we're going to address it inside the ordinance, is that as I read through this, there's no language really that discusses lots that contain prior structures. So that's, there's at least 2 areas where if the intention is a lot with a prior structure on it, could be converted to a cottage court to allow for infill development, then how does this ordinance, some of the specifics inside this ordinance relate to the prior structure and the new structures? So for instance, under the site plan review, when you talk about the major site plan review and the minor site plan review, is that when a total of structures that you're adding or a total of structures that will now exist inside the cottage court? And 2 would be the average of the unit size. So where are we spelling out that if there were potentially, 1,500 square foot units already located on a triple size lot and you wanted to add in other units, that those original, the original square footage of the property that was currently existing would not factor into that calculation, or would it? Because it would limit what you would be able to add to the space. So I want to hear, if you can just bear with me. So that's question number 1. Number 2 is, we had addressed at one point how we could restrict the potential. We were talking about the ownership structures. How can we restrict the potential for these to be used as Airbnbs? And I know we have a lot of interest at council in what type of effect the Airbnb market might have on a potential development like this. And what we're trying to not promote is a cottage court district that's highly densified for the purpose of getting housing, turning into like a hospitality hotel, a mini hotel situation. So I don't see anything in here that restricts that. And then also, I had some questions about my reaction to the list of items that are easier to approve and not so easy to approve, and how I feel like my general impression when I'm driving around Keene, how some of those things might not really apply here. And we can go through that in a separate comment, but the first 2 are really important to me, the Airbnb and then the current prior structure, how that melds together.
So I'll take those actually in reverse order. So as far as the list, again, I mean, it's not a list of you shall not. It's something that, there's a range of interpretation with every one of those. And quite honestly, I mean, this is the way we do things in Charleston, South Carolina. And I know it works here. So that's one of the reasons that I brought this idea to Keene, because I've seen it work quite well in Charleston. It provides some guidelines, but with lots of flexibility. So I think from that standpoint, it works.
So Bill,
Second,
I just want to interrupt you for a second. So I wasn't intending to get into the specifics of my questions on the list, but since we're talking about it, I love the idea of the lists. That's not my intention. What I have some concerns about is like us, obviously natural integral materials would be preferable, but I don't see I personally don't have issues seeing these buildings using composite or cladded siding in our community that would not make them stand out or not blend in with the community. I think that the level of detail maybe in our historical districts, if something like this were to happen, we might want to get into things like thicker wall depth or thinner wall depth, or vertical fenestration or horizontal fenestration. I just don't know that those specific items on the list, to me, belong on the list.
Okay.
But that's for the committee to discuss at length.
Yeah. So, short-term rentals. So, number one, I completely agree with you. It's not the intent of this ordinance, and I don't think, staff or planning board or city council, any of y'all intend for this to be used to create short-term rentals. But it's my opinion that addressing short-term rentals only for the cottage court overlay instead of for the entire city would be a mistake. The city of Keene needs a short-term rental ordinance, period. And that would address it. But addressing it only for the cottage court overlay, I think would be a mistake.
Agree.
So then with the average unit sizes and prior structures, so, that's something that would be fleshed out through that site plan review. So let's say that someone has a house sitting on a lot and they want to make that house either as one unit or divided into multiple units. They want it to be part of that site plan. That would be part of that site plan review process. If that is a 1,500 square foot structure that's going to remain one unit, then the other units would have to be small enough that you achieve the average. And again, this is getting back to providing smaller living options than what's found throughout Keene now. That's the main purpose of this, is to provide smaller housing units. So, but if they took that 1,500 square foot house and divided it into 3 units of 500 square feet each, then that would be part of their math.
I'll just jump into here as well. So I've been chewing on this question myself, and ultimately it kind of comes down to what you all think is appropriate. It would be very easy to add one word to that 1,250 square foot average and say all new dwelling units in a cottage court overlay shall have that average of 1,250. So then you wouldn't have to worry about averaging down the new units to accommodate an existing 3-family that might have 12, 13, 14, 1,500 square foot units in there. The other side, so that's a policy decision. And then you're also still going to be having to deal with impervious surface coverage and things like that. I would, in regards to the site plan threshold, I think the existing structures should be counted towards the threshold for site plan review, because if you have an existing 3-family and then you want to add 2 more units with the cottage court overlay, there is an intensity that is involved on the lot that I think potentially should be evaluated in a more comprehensive manner, as opposed to a single 3-family structure on a lot.
And I'll jump in with a little bit of reference to the short-term rental. We are exploring, we heard from council that there's a desire to figure out how to address short-term rentals, and we're batting around some ideas, and we'll definitely be coming with that. And we as staff agree with Bill that trying to target any sort of restrictive use within cottage court would be it would negatively affect the cottage court. So we want to apply it to the city as a whole. But this is my teaser trailer for someday in the near future. We'll be bringing forward what we hope will be a way to address short-term rental.
So just to
Point of order. I just witnessed Councilor Jones speaking to city staff, so I'd like to know what he asked. I
address
just
that.
don't appreciate conversation happening, sidebars happening while we're discussing, so.
I can address that. Counselor Jones asked me if New Hampshire had any restrictions on regulating short-term rentals.
So to follow up on what Evan had explained, I would support adding the word new. I think that when we look at where these lots are that are in, more in the inner city that might have prior existing structures that could be built out, those potential units are going to be, factoring them in might make the buildable units so small enough that they wouldn't be profitable enough for the developer to want to build. So I think having the new structures, when we're looking at the average size, to count those at 1250 would make sense to me. And I agree also with your point about the site plan review. I think that makes perfect sense too.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, thank you. I just give us a visual that's local. I suggest the Wright Estates as an example of what you're trying to describe. An existing structure that allowed for a huge build-out of additional units without needing to disturb the existing mansion on the site.
Exactly.
Anyway, I think your suggestion is well put.
Thank you.
Mr. Cost.
Two things and maybe a third. I'm agreeing with Councilor Bosley that trying to put a planning board hat on and the project comes and it's really nice and we get a lot of units. And then to look at this architectural guideline list is going to be, for me, really, really hard to discuss that, make a decision. Oh, well, can you do a little more vertical penetration? Will it make a difference? I don't know. It depends on where it is, what's next to, and even buildings being in context with other buildings. If you're building, maybe you have to build 9 or 10 of these things on a lot that's not near other stuff, does it matter that it doesn't look like something that's in downtown Keene or in another neighborhood? Probably not. So I just don't know how we would grapple with this, and I don't have an answer for it yet, but I think it's, these are the kind of things you end up getting wrapped around council. And so I just would like to give this piece a little more consideration. If there's another way to address it than the list. I mean, if we wanted to have, and I don't think we can, do this, that's even easier, because do this. But this range is hard, and I'm not even sure the do this bit is gonna, there must be a better way to do it. I think I would struggle with it if I was on the planning board at the time when it just came through, and really to be honest about assessing those would be just, a good person to face.
Can I jump in and respond to that
Yeah.
really quick? So I know you say that you're really concerned about it, but you've, in explaining your concern, you've hit the nail on the head. The whole point of all of those things is to kind of ensure a harmoniousness with the existing surrounding neighborhood. So these are guidelines to give to an applicant to when they're coming in for their proposal and their design to be looking at the architectural features that exist in the area that they're proposing to do. And if the site is nowhere near anything else, then I don't think there's any harm necessarily in letting them.
For that one, but, I don't know, the base differentiated, to me, the pictures didn't make a big difference. So some of those buildings are pretty cool, that were, the vertical metal went right down to the ground. So I'm just saying it would be really hard to make this decision. The other thing I was thinking about is if we're gonna have internal roads, or even driveways, I guess what's the definition of an internal road? Is a road that the city takes on? Okay. So if we have internal roads or private driveways, I would like maybe consider, it looked like they wouldn't be allowed, but if cars could park parallel, not pulling, but parallel parking. Oh my God. You missed all that. If cars could park parallel on some of the streets, because that livens up streets. It means you don't have to have more paving, you don't have to waste building space with garages, it might make it more affordable to build. So if a developer came in with a nice site plan that was logical, and, you know, there was these houses on a court, but you could park on the street, and why not? But it looked like it wouldn't be permitted according to this, because all the rules said parking has to be out of sight, out of mind. And so I'd maybe think about that. And, okay.
It's a good point in regards to the parking. If it's going to be a public right-of-way, parking on the street is definitely something that is a little more permitted, because that's not, the public right-of-way is its own entity. It's no longer the lot. It's owned by the city. We didn't put any express waiver authority in this cottage court to the planning board. We tried to keep it as light as possible, and then let the existing site plan regulations kind of dictate, so what you're more used to. We do allow off-site parking, which might be a way to address that. But in regards to keeping it as an internal drive aisles, the main thought about that is reducing the amount of impervious surface. And then if you've got a more narrow drive aisle, and you've got people parking on the shoulder, it's going to become a fire and emergency access issue. And so there is some balance between like complete utility on the site with life safety.
Well, anyway, if there's a way to think about, because I think it's dual purpose as a road, and it makes some sense, and it's just worth thinking about. The other thing, I don't know if it's part of this exactly, but these look like the perfect types of housing. Okay, they're great for rentals, but they're also the perfect type of housing for entry-level ownership. And owning a house is wealth building, and we know that's one of the big issues, that people don't have the opportunity to buy a house to start building that wealth. And so I don't know if there's any way with other policy to incentivize that developments are for, if they're for ownership, there's maybe more incentives, and I guess we have a lot of tools, rather than rentals. I mean, we want rentals too, but if we could also encourage these smaller houses, which would be perfect for, you know, entry-level first buy, and maybe somehow encourage that through some other, you know, ways, taxes or other things that happen to encourage that kind of developer to do that. Maybe they get to do a little more density if they do that, I don't know. But I think that's important, because these are what we would call, I used to call entry-level houses, you know, 1,200 square foot house was the house you'd buy. So something else to consider. Thanks.
Councilor Remy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a quick point, I do have to agree. I don't like the list. I like the idea of the list, and I think it's really cool, but I have a really hard time saying voting would 3 violations be okay if it's offset by 6 good ones, and like, how do you balance that as a board to say if there's 3 hard to approves and 6 easy to approves? Like, does that make a good application or not? So I like the concept of what's in there. I think it's just really hard to measure and manage against. I'd rather just have one of the lists, and then the other one is like, you just only have these are nice to haves, don't print the not nice to haves, and just have it. It's like the balancing act is difficult, right? It's the, but that wasn't actually why I raised my hand. It was, I'm curious if, so 508 Washington Street, does that count as a cottage court? Because it's there's not a chassis underneath, so I'm trying to find something I can.
Where are you?
508 Washington's behind Dinkbees. There's 14 buildings on a small lot, and they're all about 300 square feet.
So, Councilor Remy,
Bosley, yeah, please.
I would point to, there's a development on Green Street. Are you aware of? It's a 4-unit building, and it has like a green court that goes back, and there's 4 independent homes in the back of the lot. That, I think, it would be what you might see developed, something similar to that.
Which is why you're poking at the short-term rental?
Yes.
Because that's what that is.
Councilor House.
I think Councilor Omerod had his hand up before me, so long as I go right after.
I'll be the judge of that.
Oh, Mr. Chair, so Councilor Bosley's bringing up the short-term rentals, while true that that is an issue for the whole city, I think the cottage court developments are particularly attractive because they don't have to tear down and renovate. They could plan them from scratch. So I think that we've got to have something started on our short-term rentals for the cottage court, just because they're so attractive. Second, let's make sure when we talk about the short-term rentals that we don't rule out the places for traveling nurses, traveling physicians, untenured or pre-tenured educators, and other people that are really do a lot for our community. When their stay may be weeks or months, but not for a full 6 months or a full year. So let's make sure that we make the appropriate distinction for the traveling professionals that would come, stay there, and not just put them all in one place in one high-rise. We want them throughout the town because maybe they'll come back and live here. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Haas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilor Omerod. I have 3 short points. One, ground floor parking is ideal for development in flood zones, so that could open up new areas for that. I don't know if that's something that should be written in to the ordinance. Mr. Eubanks, you must have a lot of that in the Charleston area. Very wet neighborhood.
Yes, and I mean, and that's why we talk about, we had specifically addressed parking. As far as heights, we address parking in flood zones differently than parking under a building not in a flood zone. But yeah, in Charleston, we actually have what we call the Dutch dialogues, and that encourages raising the buildings up and having parking underneath them, because it also decreases its impervious footprint.
Great, thank you. Are there any preferable first floor occupancies, commercial, retail, et cetera, that we should be aware of that would attract developers? That's for Bill. Thank you.
Nothing that I can think of specifically. I mean, as far as the commercial uses, we've left it pretty fairly open. But uses that we felt like would be strengthening for neighborhoods. So things like, a sandwich shop, a coffee shop, things like that
Right.
would be good neighborhood, compatible with a neighborhood.
Okay. All right. And my last one was, and this is more of an opinion and a feeling thing, and I throw it out to everybody for opinions. Well, I have 2 more, one more. To address Councilor Remy's point, in the South, they like things nice and gentle and get along and consult with each other on what's nice. Up here, we just slice it and dice it and cut it. So that's the difference. But in the setback requirement, where you're allowing to eliminate a zoning requirement to match up with the existing building faces, it just occurs to me that it's kind of nice to have a difference in setbacks along the street. That gives a little more character to a neighborhood. It also allows for traffic calming and institution of different kind of sidewalks and more trees down the street. So I would, I think all of this should go through as quickly as possible with as minimal pain as possible to staff, but that might be something that we want to consider.
So if I can just address that, I do not disagree with your statement. But what we're doing here is we're allowing the possibility of meeting those existing setbacks. We're not requiring it. If they want to set back to the 15 foot, if they want to set back further, they can. It's a setback line, not a build to line.
I'm just afraid that they might want to take full advantage of the least setback possible, when it might be preferable to have the setback. But I'll leave that to staff. Thank you.
Mr. Clancy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple things. Thank you, Councilor Haas, for bringing up the setback stuff. I think we're looking at a time where traffic calming measures are definitely something we should consider. So I think we should leave that conversation open to anyone that's willing to develop one of these. And in terms of the short-term rental concern, this conversation wasn't raised up when we were discussing ADUs, which I was concerned about short-term rentals being used. So I think if we're going to make that a point of conversation, that should be a separate thing from holding this back, because I think this is an important tool in our toolbox for the city in terms of development for affordable housing or any type of housing. That I don't believe should be a part of this conversation. And and then to talk about the list of easier to approve versus not so easy to approve. I think when we were having that conversation, we really appreciated Mr. Eubanks bringing that to our attention, but it wasn't intended to be for a specific thing. It seemed like that was something we wanted to bring to any type of development in the city. So I'd like to see that as a also separate recommendation and not specifically brought for cottage courts. So those are my 3 quick things. More to come, maybe.
Councilor Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Eubanks, can I ask you, when we did our land development code, we took out the use of private roads, and it was mostly because Public Works wanted us to, because they were having problems delineating between the public and private roads. But from a housing perspective, wouldn't it help with the cottage court overlay if we did allow private roads, as long as they were built to city spec?
Oh, God, you're really just like tossing me a hard one, aren't you?
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there are a lot of jurisdictions that allow private roads. There are a lot of jurisdictions that prefer private roads because they don't want the additional maintenance. And you're right. I mean, from what the conversations that we've had with Public Works in Keene, they didn't want private streets. The thing is, in most jurisdictions, private streets still have to be built to public standards. So the conversation that we also had with Public Works was talking about differences in some of those standards to accommodate more narrow rights of ways and things like that that might be appropriate for this. They weren't very keen, no pun intended, they weren't very keen on that idea either, which is why we ended up with the language in the ordinance about them applying for a waiver. So I don't know if I've completely answered your question, but just to reiterate, private streets usually have to be built to public standards. And if you're really wanting flexibility in the design of the streets, then it would be changing those standards, which is why we opted for the waiver.
Yeah, and just to talk a little bit more about the road standard waiver process, the Public Works Department views the concept of a waiver from their road standards very differently than, like, for example, the planning board would consider a waiver from their site development standards. So I'm paraphrasing for Public Works here, but their idea is basically that what they have written down is probably the most restrictive, the most standard in a very literal sense. And on a very specific basis, they would be potentially open to essentially negotiating a more narrow right-of-way with a less amount of pavement required, and then still keeping them a public street. They weren't comfortable with putting any of that language specifically in this ordinance proposal, So, like what Mr. Eubanks just said, that section in this ordinance is kind of a signal to a potential developer that there may be an opportunity, that there may be a negotiation there. Our concern as planning staff is that injects an element of uncertainty into the development process that we were hoping to avoid. So for potentially an adventurous and a patient developer might take advantage of that, but I don't know how that will play out in reality.
So, Evan, let me also just add to that, because I think this is important. The majority of the parcels that are going to be used for this are going to be really small. The likelihood of one of these projects needing a new internal public right-of-way is I think really, really slim. We're going to be more in the realm of things that we would consider driveways that are not public rights-of-way. So I don't think this is a problem that's going to pop up often at all.
That's a really good point, Bill. Thank you. We have a development scheme for that. That's our conservation residential development subdivision. If there's a parcel of land of sufficient size to put in a new public road, that's probably a better option for everybody involved. And then we are offering those more, we're calling them driveways, but they're internal drive aisles to navigate through the internal site. And those are going to be smaller than the public road. They're not going to be a right-of-way. They're going to be the responsibility of whatever homeowners association, condo association, whoever owns the project is going to be responsible for maintaining those internal drive aisles.
But we also encourage them to make them look street-like.
I think my question's been answered. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chair. Sorry for throwing a hardball.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
That's what I'm here
Got
for.
one more. We continue to say that any parcel in this, using this overlay, must have city water and sewer service. And I want to question that notion one more time. I did that in the last hearing, and offered a couple of places where I know that's not the rule. That Dover, the most cited cottage court overlay, is in fact a septic field that's shared. In fact, a couple, I think, maybe on the site with, I don't know if that's city water or well, but I can think of, in the zones where we're permitting this, nobody would want in a high-density area, something that didn't have, but there are certainly some of these zones where the lack of city water and sewer shouldn't inhibit the development. And so I wonder, did you give some insight into those communities where this isn't the case? We know it, either Concord, Massachusetts, or Dover, New Hampshire, and how they're allowing it, and we're saying, hell no.
Evan, question for you. If I remember correctly, didn't Mary do some research on Dover about whether it was on septic or sewer?
Actually, Jesse did some research.
Okay.
Jesse did research.
So the Dover development is on public water, and parts of it, there are a couple units that are on a shared septic, but the majority of it is on what they actually went with, and I am not a sewer expert, but they went on a forced main, so they had to pump water up to the public system, which is, I think, what people saw and thought was shared septic system. So my understanding from talking to Dover was that it is actually, the full development is on public water and sewer.
So, and just to kind of,
But I'm sorry, just for the clarification. But it is pumping from the site into the sewer system.
It's a pump
It's an
station.
enormous hole. I mean,
It's a pump
They dug
station,
halfway
but
to
that's
another
not-
city, but,
So
So,
we,
so Mayor, just to clarify, it's a pump station, but that's still a sanitary sewer system, not a septic system.
Yeah, it doesn't have a leach field.
We have pump stations all over the place here because we're so flat, gravity doesn't work very well. So we have lots of pump stations in neighborhoods, but it's still sanitary sewer system.
so just kind of to broadly contemplate why we wanted to tie in this proposal with city utilities was in part just because as we've been adopting the land development code and exploring different housing opportunities in lots of different ways, a lot of feedback we were getting from residents was that we should be increasing housing opportunities where those services exist. So we crafted the fact that there's no minimum density or no maximum density on the concept that these were going to be smaller lots. They were going to have city water and sewer. And I would be concerned with opening that like level of, essentially like opening the barn door and just letting all the animals run right out with larger parcels in the rural zone, and then basically letting somebody come in and then just pack them in really tight. That's not really what this proposal was intended for, and one of the ways to limit the location for this kind of development was to tie it with water and sewer.
Counselor Bosley.
So I'd also just like to point out that through this process of adopting the land development code, and that which took years, there was a lot of public comment. And then post adopting that, we changed the rural underlying zoning or acreage requirement for the rural zoning district. And as part of that, we also adopted an ordinance that allowed for these conservation residential developments. And when we did that, and I'm not gonna have all of the language exactly right, so staff can tune me up here, but we, if you opt to do a conservation residential development, there are mechanisms to significantly increase density and to build those out in a way that protects site-specific things like watersheds and wetlands, or topographical areas that aren't buildable, and allows you to densify certain areas that are more appropriate for development on those larger sites. And there was a lot of like threading the needle in the rural zone. And so rural and agriculture for us are pretty much the only zones that don't have access to city water and sewer. Like LD1 has just water, is that correct?
It's got to have sewer, and then
It's
it
gotta
can
have
either
sewer.
have city water or private wells for LD1.
So there are, there's like a little, but it's a very tiny percentage of our overall zoning map that associates to LD1. But really, it's rural that you see the no access. And we have created mechanisms to put some density there. And we did push that zone to allow for those smaller lot sizes and already. And I think that what we're talking about here is a major densification potential where we have no minimums associated with this ordinance, and you could really impact that part of the city negatively, like as an unintended consequence, if you just let people run free with no setback requirements and no density requirements. And I think that we did hear from the public that they do want that area protected.
Thank you. Mr. Clancy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I remember a rural district on Old Walpole Road being it had water, city water. Part of that road does, and it's considered rural district. And I agree with the mayor, and in this ordinance, we are including rural as a possible site from what I remember reading. And I don't see a good reasoning for restricting different districts. We're a city in need of housing, and I don't see this being something that people are going to be clamoring to do. We're seeing, are ADUs being built by the thousands? No. I don't think we should restrict a district just because they don't have sewer and water. There are many ways to do it, and it's up to the developer to decide. So when the city's reworking this to bring a final proposal to us, I don't think they should exclude access to city sewer and water from that proposal.
Thank you. Ms. Fasani?
Thank you. So I agree that there should be an opportunity to review it if necessary. Is that a possibility that, I don't think it should be encouraged, but if there was an opportunity for them to use a sewer system instead, and that made sense for that particular area, could the developer then decide to come with a plan with a variance for that particular thing? Because if that was the case, then we could just allow that to happen instead of putting it in that it would be allowed.
That's a very good point. So it is possible to go to the Zoning Board of Adjustment to get a variance from any of the provisions in this ordinance. So that does provide an avenue. But yeah, it would be, the hardship test would be interesting. And then there's nothing preventing a provincial developer from extending water and sewer lines to a potential lot at their cost, if they so chose. Another thing is that private well and septic are expensive. And not to say that hooking into city services isn't expensive, but if we're really trying to target as low cost as possible, especially as low cost as possible to the end user, having city utilities is cheaper in the long run than having private well and septic.
Councilor Remy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I definitely think that we need to restrict this to where there is or can be water and sewer if they're willing to do it, to the point of like allowing for them to install it. Because I can't imagine trying to drop like 100-unit thing into a 10-acre lot in the middle of nowhere because there's no minimum lot size. And it's 100 units of small houses, not multifamilies. It's a really inefficient use of land to just clear cut that and put in a bunch of tiny houses. I think we have a process, the CRD process, which there was a lot of thought put into that around protecting land around it and how do you make sure that you're using the density in the right way. So yeah, I definitely think we need to restrict it to at least where there can be water and sewer. Similar, I mean, we have an LD1 project that went in and they paid to get pipes extended to do that so they could increase their density. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, or shouldn't allow that. But yeah, I don't think that it should be allowed where there's not water and sewer.
Thank you. I'm going to call a quick timeout here, as Chairman's prerogative. We have a number of things we've discussed with respect to the proposed ordinance, the height and number of floors, whether or not daycare was appropriate to have included as one of the commercial items, setbacks, architectural standards, short-term rental question, maybe in here, maybe not. How do we address the existing structure and existing units, or let's say a clarification around that area? And then this discussion we've just had about city water and sewer, restricting it to just that area. So I've mentioned a few things. I'm happy now to continue the discussion, given that we've already hit on these. So if there are other areas that you'd like to discuss, I'd be happy to entertain that. Councilor Remy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just more of a clarifying question of what's the expected outcome from tonight's meeting? Like, what's the motion from tonight?
Well, it's a workshop, so we could, with the plan, so a workshop, the outcome is potentially one of three areas. It moves forward and that the P.L.D. calls for a public meeting, asks the mayor to set a public meeting, and the planning board says it's consistent with the master plan. If those are not going to be the outcomes, then we can continue. Did I say that correctly?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. There's a certain amount of modification that could happen tonight that would allow the ordinance more or less to progress through the process undelayed. But at some point, it might become an A version of itself, which I'm not sure if it has to then come back, it then has to come back to this body as a written A version, which is going to delay the adoption by about a month. For a clarification, like adding the word new to those dwelling units wouldn't necessarily be a significant modification that would require an A version. I know in regards to the fire separation section, staff wants to add the word building in there, so it'll say applicable building and fire codes, because currently it just says fire codes. Those small changes were probably okay. If we start getting into like seriously modifying that easier and more difficult list, then we're gonna get closer into needing to do an A version. And then in regards to the height, I'm kind of on the fence with that one. But depending on the amount of changes to the height, it would probably end up needing to be an A version. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I know we're staff, we're excited. I'm very excited in general by the feedback from everybody tonight. It sounds like we're all on board with the general concept, and we just got a couple areas we're kind of really trying to nail down. So I'm not opposed to maybe doing an A version, showing all the changes we talked about more or less tonight, and then getting a really nice product that we're all excited about. But that's ultimately, that's up to you guys how you want to proceed.
Councilor Haas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in the interest of expediting, the changes I've heard proposed tonight don't sound particularly onerous. Might we go to schedule a public session, a public workshop? This is the public workshop, a public presentation at the next step through P.L.D., and then take that feedback before we send staff back to revise everything.
Councilor Bosley.
No. So, the process of how these ordinances are adopted through council, right, it's very lengthy, and it starts and stops in different places. If you stop it in a certain place, it goes back to the beginning. So if we go to a public hearing and we hear additional feedback, which you would hope that those folks might have shown up tonight, but if they did not, and we heard potential feedback, and P.L.D. recommended that we send the ordinance back to joint committee, like what happened with the casino ordinance earlier, it will have to go to another public hearing. So your every A version, B version gets brought back through a formal public hearing process, and it has to have a first reading and a second reading. Each version has to have a first reading and second reading at full council, and has to go back to P.L.D. for a final recommendation. So the more we rework this, the longer the process takes, for sure. If we can, I heard Harold's list. I'm so thankful that you kept that because that was a lot of conversation tonight. I think if anybody has, there's a couple of Scribner's changes that staff brought up, I think are fine. I think if anybody has anything that was particular that's on that list that they feel super strongly about, that maybe we could vote on those things.
Okay.
To see if we want to get an A version. But we should do that here tonight, and then we can have that come back before us in a month, and recommend our public hearing on that final draft version.
So we're another month to, or we're conceivably another month to another joint
Correct.
meeting, and then another month to a
Public
public hearing, and then another month
Month
to
to
P.L.D.
P.L.D.
recommendation, and
That's
another
correct.
month to council
And-
first reading.
Or we can choose to not change the product that's in front of us outside of the Scribner's changes.
To me, that saves one step. All right.
Mr. Clancy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we need to take a break right now, or you good? I thought you were asking for a break from the discussion earlier. You good? Okay.
No,
So
I was calling a timeout
Oh.
on the discussion.
Oh, okay.
That
Sorry.
We've captured certain items that were
Yep.
discussed already.
Yep.
And I don't think there's a
Yeah. So
important to discuss those unless we're going to vote on them
Yeah.
individually.
So for my
So if you have other items
Yeah.
that you would
Yeah.
like to bring up,
Thank you,
I'd
Mr.
be
Chair.
happy to hear that.
Yep. So from what I'm hearing, and since rural district is being included in this, but there's very limited options, and there's some concern about a 10-acre parcel being developed with a ton of tiny, is there a way we could include language saying that a maximum lot size be developed with cottage courts? So take the minimal acreage for a rural district property and include that language in as the maximum for a cottage court overlay. Because I think these shouldn't be limited to just center of Keene, or, downtown and the low-density districts. I think they should be everywhere, but I do hear the concern about allowing them on a 10-acre property and stuff like that. So I think they should be allowed in the rural district, not on city sewer and water, but to a limitation of the minimum of the rural district.
Thank you. Councilor Bosley?
So I would also like to point out that, and this is kind of a difficult process because of the way we meet here at Joint Committee with the Planning Board, but we have very different roles, each of our boards have here. And the Planning Board ultimately is gonna look at this ordinance, and you're going to decide if it meets the master plan. It's council's objective to try to craft language inside of this ordinance that we feel like is going to benefit the community as a whole. And so I've seen before, us modify ordinances here that go to council and get lost because council doesn't support something in it. And my concern about the rural district, because this has come up before, is that that could be a deal breaker.
Mr. Clancy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I take that into account, the master plan into account, and the reason why I bring things up. And one of the things is in the master plan, I mean, when we use the master plan to approve of something, a lot of, and I brought this up at a previous meeting for the planning board, it seems like we are given what works for what's being proposed and not looking at the whole plan, whereas something else could be used. And so I look at the master plan and I see the need for housing, affordable housing in this community. And this hits those things, but only if it is accessible to the city as a whole. There are very few properties in the districts that are connected to city sewer and water that will be able to even achieve this. And will those properties, even the developers of those properties, even use this? So I think from a planning board perspective and the master plan, it needs to be open to the whole city and all districts to fulfill those needs of affordable housing, workforce housing, and all those. And, if it needs to be septic and well, so be it. And I'm willing to work with those concerns that the city had when reducing the rural district size. And my proposal is, don't allow it beyond the minimal lot size for the rural district.
Okay, thank you. I think we understand your position there. Counselor Jones?
Thank you. I think based on what Ryan is saying and what Kate has said, it sounds like there's a lot of questions yet, and I think having a continuation is a better process than if we moved this on to a public hearing, because then if there's more questions and more changes and significant changes, it's got to come back here for the whole process over again, and then go to the public hearing, then go to the P.L.D., then go to the council once again as an A version, and could get changed and sent back to the process again. So I think a continuation would probably, this is just my opinion, would be the better option right now. I'm not making a motion, I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, it's a little early for a motion, but thank you. Counselor Williams?
I guess I would just echo Counselor Bosley's sense that, there is quite a bit of opposition to this in the rural district. We've seen that on council. People turn out and oppose it. I'd hate to see that kind of opposition to this, especially when, we really have put in the thought to design and craft the conservation district, which is meant for the rural district, and really created with the input of people in the rural district. So I would be pretty hesitant to, having already done this, now spring this on them, which is, potentially considerably quite a bit more density. I just don't think it would be particularly popular. And as someone who, might like to get reelected someday, that is a concern.
Thanks. Mr. Cost?
Yeah, I mean, after hearing the discussion and Counselor Bosley and the whole process, a little of what you're saying, Counselor Williams, I think this is really good. And we're picking at certain things, and we could pick at things for 20 more years. And so, I just think this is really needed. I could imagine a developer actually using this. I mean, if I could, I would. So I think we should just be cautious about trying to wring out everything we think would make it more perfect, and then watch it go down the road and maybe even get into some, opposition from certain people who live in certain areas. So I don't know. It just sounds to me anything we could do not to keep putting it off and make this a longer and longer and longer process would be helpful. We want to get something done. We want to get housing. We have something very nice in front of us.
Mr. Chairman, would it be appropriate for me to make a comment?
Yes, please, go ahead, Bill.
So I'm listening to what everybody's talking about, and I understand some of the concerns and some of your desires. But I also think that some of these things, I mean, like, someone wanting to do this where there's septic, or somebody wanting to do this in a rural district. I mean, I don't think that those are things that are going to pop up a lot. And I kind of hate to see this get tabled for a circumstance that may never even show its face. Ordinances can also be amended. I think it's really important right now to keep the momentum of this moving forward. I think there are developers that are waiting on this to happen. I would hate to see this get delayed. And quite honestly, I mean, if it is delayed, as your consultant, I'm not even sure exactly what path you're wanting us to go down as far as changes. So I would suggest to y'all that that section 17.5.3, that we section C, that we add the word building so it's building in fire codes. And then in 17.5.3A, that we add the word new in front of units, which would satisfy a lot of the concerns right there with just two words. and then you let this move forward. And if you find out that there are developers in the rural area, developers that are unseptic, that are interested in this, you look at maybe revising the ordinance then. But and if let's say that you find out that the architectural guidelines are confusing for the developers, then you look at maybe changing those then. I would really recommend moving forward with this and not stopping the momentum that you have as a city.
Yep, thanks for your comments. Councilor Omrod.
Thank you. I appreciate the chairs, your pausing and listing 5 or 6 things that there were a lot of discussion on. There may be some merit in taking some time to going through and voting on them, perhaps not tonight, but if we continue to 1 more month, that's a lot better than delaying 4 months by going through the whole cycle and coming back again. So I appreciate your list, and I would support digging deeper into that, but coming out with that, voting on something at the next session.
Thank you. Councilor Remy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do you mind running through your list again?
No, I don't mind at all.
Can we do it slowly?
Slowly, because I'm writing notes here,
Oh,
because I
okay.
might end my question with something that might not.
So the height of the height and number of floors restriction. Daycare as something that would be one of the permitted commercial uses with residential above it.
Can I go back and forth and clarifying what's in there today? So it's the height one, what's in there today, we were questioning whether we wanted it. There was just a general question about the heights, I think. I don't think there was a specific, we should change this, was there?
No, I think the mayor suggested that we might be able to put another floor in.
Parking was.
And there was a discussion, and it wasn't super clear about the parking underneath.
But that would require a change to the motion or to the ordinance as written and would likely be an A version. To add a floor.
Doesn't need to be an A version, it can just be substitute 3 with 4. Or substitute that parking
Yeah,
would allow
clarifying
for a
sentence,
fourth.
right.
Oh, sorry, I'm just still going, I just wanted to make sure I understand what each of the takeaways are. The daycare one was whether it should or shouldn't be, but I never heard a final, I don't think it should be from anyone. It was just understanding the clarification.
Councilor Williams, yeah, it's your,
Yeah,
you had raised it.
It was whether housing units should be required on top of daycare usage.
Required.
Yeah.
And Councilor Williams, are you comfortable leaving it the way it's written, or would you like to see us vote on that?
I have it would be nice to vote, but if it's easier to grease the skids and get this out of here by not, then we don't have to.
And I guess the same question for the mayor is, if we were to move forward with it as is, are you okay with that moving forward as is, and we could go back and look at adding a floor? Or would you prefer we vote on making an amendment to?
I think the change is clear enough that we could do that tonight. It's not a big deal. I mean, to me, it's a big deal to a developer to be able to put parking underneath and still put 3 floors above. But I don't think it's a huge change in this ordinance.
So without legal here to give us direction, I can hear Tom Mullins in my head. He would say, at some point, you make enough changes that are substantive enough, and it creates an automatic A version, and the process needs to restart. So I know if we change a couple of words, he would probably let that pass, and we could clarify this with Amanda. But I feel like if we start making these changes, which I think we can all vote on tonight and make decisions about, it would definitely become an A version.
So, what was the next one on I was just trying to go through all of them, so I understood where all the sources for all of them were, unless you have a.
Yep.
Yeah.
Councilor
My
Omrod.
comment was relevant to your point about height. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My concern with the height is we're limiting to 2.5 stories almost everywhere in the city. And if that's what we really want to do, when there could be 3-story Victorian, especially on smaller lot sizes. So that is a little bit different than than Mayor Khan's parking and how they count it. So just want to clarify that that's why I brought that up, that there
Okay.
may be appropriate places to go 50 feet or 3 stories, or at least a process to get that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Mr.
You
Rounds,
should
no,
continue.
please, yeah, if you're done, Counselor
so-
Omrod.
Evan and I were talking, and again, we are not legal, so Counselor Bosley is it's well taken to take this with a grain of salt. But our recollection of the process for the A version is if you request concrete changes, things like the garage doesn't count as a floor, those sorts of things, still under 50 feet. And we make those changes, and you continue to the next meeting, and we come back with that A version. So enough changes have been made, but it's still an A version. Then the process continues.
Correct.
So I think as long as every direction is very clear and it's not come up with an idea, then it can, the A version doesn't have to go back through any process. It can continue forward with the next joint committee meeting. So you'd still have to go, we'd still have to have another joint committee meeting before we could move forward. But as long as they are concrete, specific changes, we're good to go forward. I just wanted to clarify. I think that's what you were saying. I just wanted to,
Yes, it would require a second first reading.
yes. Oh, okay.
At council.
It would. That's, okay.
If you create an A version, it would have to go to council for a first reading before the public hearing. But that's fine, it's a couple of weeks, it's not bad.
Counselor Jones.
Yes, I like
Yeah, okay.
Because I want to be clear, my intent is if we can get through the point where it's none of them are deal breakers for anyone, and that's why I'm trying to just speak to the people who had the initial issue with it. And I know, Raleigh, Councilor Omrad, I did not mean to skip you because I know you did have concerns on that one. But I just wanted to go through each of them and understand where the actual concern was, because I could end my question with a motion.
No, that's fine.
I think it's
That's
the way to
where
go.
that's why I wrote down the list. And
Yeah, so we got to daycare, and there was a thought, but it's not a roadblock, is what I heard.
Okay,
What was the next one on the list?
setbacks potentially being a problem.
Can't remember.
Not allowing the option to follow the building line, rather follow the existing zoning requirement in that, even if the buildings on both sides don't follow the existing zoning requirement.
Is it clarifying the same question, is it a roadblock for you if we were to move forward without it and address it later, or is that one that you want to address now?
It's just a thought.
Just a thought.
Not a roadblock. Expedite.
And thank you for putting up with me, Mr. Chair, and the rest of the group
Sure.
for going through this like this.
Next on my list is the architectural standards.
See, and that one was me. I don't like those two lists, but I'm, again, not a roadblock for me. I would rather eliminate it and just have the good list, or just have the bad list instead of having both. Because it creates some kind of a points system as opposed to, but it's not a roadblock for me. I don't know if anybody else.
Yeah, Ms. Markle.
So that is not something that we're going to use to approve, right? We're
Yeah.
just using that's just for the developer. Is that right?
No, these projects would come before the planning board.
Right, but the
And
developer
each
is
project,
using
we
that
would use this list to, as
And
part of
we're
our
using-
assessment.
The developer is using the list. We're using our existing standards, right? That's what. it
Not
seemed-
necessarily.
Oh, I
Um,
thought that's what you had said.
Yeah, so their guidelines, they're not hard yeses and hard nos. But ultimately, an element of the product that's gonna come before you is going to be, does this fit within neighborhood character? And so the list is designed to sort of guide a developer to use things that promote harmonious sitting into a neighborhood, and that if you choose to not do that and you choose to go outside of neighborhood character, you may receive opposition from the neighborhood itself. You may receive opposition from individual planning board members who want a more like traditional New England vernacular style as opposed to something more dramatic. And so those lists are guidance to a developer.
I guess that's what I am stuck on. The list is for the developer. We already have our guidelines.
Can I speak to that?
I think the point is, we do have in the planning, in the LDC, or our standards for approving,
Right.
rejecting a project. The wording is, as Mr. Clements just said, it just kind of has to fit the existing neighborhood.
Yeah,
These-
and if-
This is much more specific than
I guess
than
I'm just
that.
trying to, this is something that we asked for because it would be helpful for developers. And now we're worried about trying to approve or not approve something, but we're not really using the list. The developers are.
I think that would be fair to say, and also the language in the planning board's architectural and visual appearance standards are, for lack of a better word, that same like nebulous sort of architectural lingo. So we're talking about like massing and scale, visual interest, architectural features such as dominant gable ends, cornices, granite sills, arched openings, large window framed with architecturally consistent trim and patterns that provide visual interest, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's not anything more concrete in the planning board's existing guidelines than what is articulated in that list. It's still going to be a discussion and some give and take between the board and the developers to come to a consensus on what the board thinks fits.
Can I speak to that? Mr. Chairman?
I'm all done.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Eubanks, please.
So I think it's really important to say that that this is not a yes no. It's not an either or. It's not a sliding scale. There's no point system here. That you've got to get 70% of these right to get approved or anything like that. This provides some general guidance to the developer of things he needs to be thinking about before he goes to the planning board or she goes to the planning board. And if they look at this list and they say, okay, well, we're gonna do these things, but we're not gonna do these things, they go to planning board. They could, in theory, ignore everything on the left-hand column and still come up with a fantastic building that fits the context. I don't know how that would be possible, but it is possible. But the planning board still has total authority to make a ruling on this based on their gut, how they feel about it, if they think it fits the context or not, if it needs to fit the context or not. These are just some general guidelines that hopefully give the developer some direction to help assure that y'all get things that you're going to be proud of and not things that you're going to be ashamed of. But it's subjective. It's totally subjective. But I know also that it works here in the city of Charleston.
All right, thank you. Yeah, no, I think we understand that part of it. But I mean, if this is in an ordinance that's passed by the city council, it will become part of the planning board's approval standards. And it's not just something that the developers can decide to do or not do. I mean, they have to realize that the planning board will evaluate their project based on these specific things, whether or not they're subjective or not, but some of these are less subjective than others. Anyway, so architectural standards, sorry. Councilor Jones, did you have a question before? Or?
No, I just didn't know if we got through 15.
No, we didn't. We didn't. Oh, Mr. Hafer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been trying to work up the courage for my first public comments here, so I appreciate the opportunity. Personally, I don't have a concern with the architectural guidelines as presented, although I may quibble about wall depth. I think on a whole, the concept of having some leeway back and forth is a good thing to have to move forward. And would just echo any comments around moving this forward, despite my newbie nature. If this is what 17 people who generally agree that this is a good thing to do for the city, I think we should try to move it forward. So I'll end my comments with that.
Thank you. Okay. No, all right. The next one I had was short-term rental, and I think we said that that's going to be a citywide issue and not addressed in this particular ordinance, but it was discussed quite a bit. Next one I have is clarification around an existing structure or existing units. And I think if we insert the word new, that was kind of the solution that was proposed. Similarly, a very simple insertion of a word building in the building and fire code line. And then finally, the whether or not city water and sewer would be a requirement of a project.
Thank you for going through the list with me, Mr. Chair. That was very helpful. I, at the end of my sentence, would move to find ordinance O 2024-01 adjusted for the two Scribner's errors of building in 17.5.3 and new in 17.5.3A in the appropriate locations consistent with the master plan.
Do we have I need somebody from the planning board to second that, I think. Mr. Cost, second, thank you.
I second that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we need, so thanks for your patience. Would you like to speak?
Hi, Laura Tobin. Just primarily one, I guess at this point, quick thing. In terms of the building and fire code, is that something that will be maintained? So basically, if it's a managed property, is that something that will be followed up on? And I guess I ask that because one of the challenges with a lot of the apartments is the conditions are not necessarily maintained. So if this is going to be essentially for families, starter homes, that type of a thing, it should be something where they can stay there over a period of time. So I'm wondering if that's...
I think the answer to that is we would address the proposal and to approve it or not approve it based on that language. Once it's built, the city has an enforcement group that has to deal with that.
So it would there's...
So the planning board or P.L.D., we don't go out and look at anybody's properties.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious if there is an opportunity to include that language anywhere. So if it's not, if it were not an apartment necessarily, if it's not a condominium, if it's not a house, is that something, if it's property management, is there something where, say, every 5 years, there could be some sort of safety fire code inspection, that type of a thing?
Mr. Chairman, can I address that question?
No, I think this is a keen question.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Okay.
Yes, Councilor Bosley.
Thank you. So what I would say to that is similar to where I think we got with the Airbnb conversation. And what the chair was leaning into is that what we really need to discuss here tonight is the language inside the ordinance, that the city has its own language for enforcement and code and building and fire. And council is working on that, and I'm sure you're gonna be involved in all of that process soon. And I know staff is working on different housing standards, and there are different areas in our land development code where those standards live and what the enforcement mechanisms are and what our personal theories and processes on that is. And all of that outside of this ordinance needs to get worked on in a whole for the whole city and not just for this one particular item. So I think your points are very well taken. There are some issues that we are aware of in the community. Staff is aware that we would like to see a lot of it worked on. And I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about that from community development to direct to council.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Can I also just add something specifically with the ordinance, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please, Mr. Clemens.
So that section is really focused on building separation. So with the elimination of like side yard setbacks, there are other rules out there that dictate a fire separation. So that provision is really talking about if they're going to be detached units, they can be as close together as applicable building and fire codes allow them to be. And those building, fire, and life safety codes apply 100% of the time, 365 days a year. So getting onto the issues of enforcement aside, those rules will always apply in a development.
Thank you. Councilor Omar, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, we are discussing the motion.
We should be.
And I am discussing the motion, which does not include items on your list. So the motion is not including those items on their list. And I want to propose a way to deal with that if it's amenable to Mayor Khan on the height, because that could be a citywide issue or a zone by zone, district by district. And that may be beyond the scope of what we're trying to accomplish tonight.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to say that, not seeing any further public, we do have a motion and a second on the floor, so I think we need to.
Yeah, let me close the public portion. Thank you for your patience, Ms. Tobin.
Point of order,
Councilor Remy.
if I need to remake my motion
Yes,
now that the
you will
public
need
hearing is
to
closed.
remake
just
your
to-
motion, yep.
I would restate my motion as I previously stated with suggesting the ordinance O 2024-01 is consistent with the master plan following the correction of the Scrivener's errors in 17.5.3 to add building where appropriate and in 17.5.3A to add new where appropriate.
Mr. Cost, second, thank you. So that leaves all the wording as is, all the other thing, right, everything else that we talked about, okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cohen.
No, I'll
Mayor
speak,
Cohen,
I'll
yeah.
speak, it's okay. I'll speak to the motion, but I just want to direct people to the map and notice how much of that map is in the light yellow and yellow. And to Mr. Clancy's point, which I think is what was in the back of my mind, thinking of the areas that I believe are without water and sewer, it cuts out a lot of territory in the city. And again, I want to make clear, I want to see this go forward. But I want the same understanding that I have of these significant territories in the city not being able to take advantage of the density that this is proposing. That's why I stick to the idea. I think it's doable, and I think we are limiting the application of this in a manner that If the majority wants to have that limitation on it, okay. But I think we need to have eyes open as we do it.
Thank you. Do we want to table your motion again and vote on some of the separate items? Like water and sewer required?
Yeah.
Does someone want to, let's table the motion.
I have a motion out there, a second.
Okay, okay, we'll take a vote on it. All right, all those in favor of approving with the two corrections that Councilor Remy proposed? All those in favor?
We don't vote, Ed, sorry, not yet.
All opposed? Okay,
Two opposed. Pass.
all right. So the motion is passed with the two Scrivener corrections. Okay.
And I would like to hear a motion from P.L.D.
I would move, being that the planning board is satisfied with that they can work with this, it sounds like I would move that the P.L.D. recommend the mayor set a public hearing.
Thank you, Counselor Jones. Do I have a second?
Second?
I have a motion by Counselor Jones, second by Counselor Williams, and I know we have some new members. So I just want to point out that this is a motion or this is a motion of formality. There is no point where this ordinance could move forward without a public hearing, but we get to do this as at the end of this meeting in general. But even if we said no, the mayor would still have to do this. So with a motion and a second on the table, all in favor? And that is unanimous.
Can I say
Okay.
something to the ordinance now and vote on? I think
Yes, please.
Kate was hearing Tom Mullins in her ear. I hear the city clerk in my ears. Even though we made two minor changes, it's not the same product that was advertised, and because of those two small changes, it becomes an A version, the way it's noticed to the public.
Okay, well, we've.
But that would be our next
we've
notice
already-
anyway. We don't have to do it now.
We need to clarify if it's an A version or not.
Yeah, which staff can follow up on.
Yep.
Great.
Thank you.
I mean, with the two Scrivener errors addressed as moved, this is not an A version. This would move forward more or less as advertised with those two minor adjustments.
Okay, but.
I'm sorry, was that the question? We were kind
that
of
was the question, but
scrambling
we
over
probably would all
the
feel
vote
better
there.
if city attorney weighed in.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Okay.
A long one.
So, next. Next item on the agenda is new business. Are there any items of new business that board members would like to see added to a future joint meeting? Councilor Jones.
Thank you very much. I started discussion earlier on, this is great for new business. Just to point out the nodes, in case, I know there's some new people here that don't know what the nodes are. There's three of them, all in West Keene. They're little commercial areas. One would be Upper Court Street, where we have the American Legion, the Dunkin' Donuts, the Savings Bank of Walpole, and 7-Eleven. The other is where Summit Road and Park Avenue fork. You have the Irving Station, you have Cliffy's, you have a laundromat, a Chinese restaurant, and so on. And then the third one would be lower down on Park Avenue, where you have Jack's Hardware and what's called Park Market?
Park Avenue Deli.
Park Avenue Deli. Yeah, I still call them McClay's too. Those are the three nodes that I was talking about, just in case. They're small commercial areas that can be affected. We approved a new licensing board last year, and they right now have the potential to approve certain things that could go into those areas that I think would affect those areas. So if we could, maybe in the future, look to delineating the difference in those commercial areas.
Thank you. Councilor Omerion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I heard a lot of energy and interest for short-term rentals, having a way that, in the interest of preserving potential for having more residents. And, protecting things that we want, like traveling nurses, et cetera. So I would think that that would be something we would want to have on the agenda to define that, what it is and what it isn't, and then to consider some ordinances on that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, is that, so legislative experience here, the legislature has guarded this area because of the conflict between enterprise and municipal restrictions, and has not given municipalities that ability to limit this. Good. I'm glad it looks like Jesse thinks that he can address this, which is what I was hoping.
So,
Mr. Reynolds, thank you.
And thank you both. This is complicated, and to try and get at all of this. So there was a decision last year by the not last year, a couple of years ago by the Supreme Court that clarified that short-term rental is not a residential use, and therefore, depending on how you define residential use, you can regulate it. I would also say that we can't, in any of our regulations, carve off a particular group of people. So we can't say traveling nurses or visiting professors, that sort of thing, would have different regulations. I think there are a number of ways to get at short-term rental that seek not to discriminate. And so what I'd like to propose, or just ask you all, is let planning and community development get a chance to sort of get our hands around this, propose some ideas. We believe that there are tools already on the books that would allow us to do this without creating a whole new process. But we need to explore that. We need to talk with the city attorney. We need to understand the tools we have, because the mayor is absolutely right. This is a very difficult area to play in. There are a lot of rules that we don't want to run afoul of. And the legislature and the state has been clear that this is an important part of the tourist economy that the state as a whole relies on. So we want to be very careful. And so I would urge you to allow us to take some time. We know that we need to do this, and so we're looking at it right now. And anything we do will come before you all before we go anywhere. So give us a chance.
Okay, thank you. I'll be happy to remind you. Any other new business suggestions? Mr. Clancy?
Sidebar, I'd just like to thank Mr. Eubanks for sitting through this ordeal. And then my new business would be, so I'm coming up on my year anniversary of being on planning board, and tonight I notice law enforcement being here for almost the entirety of the meeting. So I was curious about if there was a policy change, or if there is a reason that any member should be concerned about for this change, because none of my meetings that I've attended, joint or planning board, has required law enforcement to be here. So just clarification on any changes or concerns that any member should be.
It was just the possibility of an unruly public being here. That did not materialize. So the city manager thought that that could possibly happen. So
if that be the case, does that not, if it was a concern, then shouldn't the city attorney have been here to answer questions if it was such a controversial issue? I feel like there's a disconnect between that so what was the concern?
No, it's not an issue for the city attorney. It's an issue for the decorum of this board and our discussion, that everything goes through the chair, and when people are speaking, they get to finish their thoughts, and then everyone else gets a chance.
I missed the last joint meeting, so was that an issue at the last joint meeting? Is there an ongoing issue that we should know about?
Nope, not that I know of. Okay. Seeing no further hands, I will proceed to the dating of the next meeting. The next joint planning board P.L.D. meeting will be April 8th, 2024, 6:30 p.m. in these council chambers. Okay, and I will now adjourn this meeting at 9:30 p.m. Thanks, everybody.